Welcome to this exciting Blender tutorial. Today, we'll create this awesome looking organic mystery rock. So, let's dive in. Switch to the Geometry Nodes workspace, click on New to add a new network, then press Shift A and add a UV sphere, drag it here to connect, and move this node to the side. Press Shift A again and add a triangulate node, and also a delete geometry node. Our geometry just disappeared. We'll fix that in a moment, but first, right-click on this area and select Close Area to make some space. Then press Shift A and add a noise texture, and also a math node. Change the math node type to greater than, connect the noise texture to the math node and the math node to the selection input of delete geometry node. We have our geometry back. In the noise texture node, select the scale to 2, detail to 4, and the distortion to 1.8. And also in the math node, change the threshold to 0.52. Then add a subdivision surface modifier and change the render resolution to 1. Next, add a displace modifier, click on New to create a new texture, and click on this icon to go to the Texture tab. Now change the type to Cloud, Noise Spaces to Original Berlin, and set the size to 4.1. Then go into the Modifier tab and set the strength to 0.860. Then click on this drop-down menu and select Duplicate. Click on this icon to create a new texture and then view that texture. Change the type to Magic and set the depth to 3 and turbulence to 4.2. Then go back into the Modifier tab and add a Solidify modifier. Change the thickness to -0.99. It looks super chaotic, but this is where the real magic happens. Add a Remesh modifier and select Smooth Shading. Now we have our organic rock shape. Let's add a UV sphere and scale it up. Then add a plane and rotate it on the x-axis by 90 degrees by pressing R, X, and 90. Then move it back on the y-axis and scale it up. And let's quickly rename everything by selecting the objects and pressing F2. Then select the plane, change the editor type to Shader Editor, and click on New to create a new material. Name this material BG_matte. Then click on this node and press Ctrl+Shift+T. And by the way, if this shortcut is not working for you, make sure to go into the Preferences and turn on Node Wrangler add-on. Now delete this node and connect Object Coordinates to the Mapping node. Then add a Noise Texture node and connect the Mapping node to the Noise Texture. Ctrl+Shift and left click on this node to view it. But before that, go into the Render tab and change the render engine to Cycle and Device to GPU, and set the max samples for the viewport to a small number such as 8. Then in the viewport, press Z and select Render. Now in the Noise Texture node, decrease the scale of the noise, which will increase the scale of it on the object. Then press Shift-D to duplicate node to it and change the noise type to Rigid Multifractal. You can reduce the scale of the noise if you want, but we're mainly interested here in the gain and the detail parameter. Which will give us this awesome look. Now add a mix node and connect the first noise in the A input and the second noise in the B input. Then drag the slider to about 0.8 and connect the output to the base color of the material. Now let's add a color ramp node and connect the second noise in its input. Then drag the slider till we have only a few spots left. Something like this. Then expand the emission menu and connect the color ramp in the emission strength and change the color to blue. Ctrl+Shift and left click to view. Now let's select our stone and name this material stone_matte. Click on this node and press Ctrl+Shift+T, delete this node, and connect object coordinates to the mapping node. After that, add a noise structure node and Ctrl Shift and left click to view. But we cannot see our material, and that is because when we use geometry nodes to create geometry, we need to apply the material from the geometry nodes. Change the editor type to geometry nodes editor, and in the modifiers tab, click on this first modifier. Then add a set material node and select our stone material. But our material is still not visible, and that is because of this remesh modifier. Because we added our material in the geometry node, which is also a modifier. And when we added remesh, it deleted that material. But we can easily fix it by creating a new geometry node modifier. Then add a set material index node and change the index to 1. Now we can see our material. Let's go back to shader editor. Move these nodes to the side and reduce the scale of the noise. Then duplicate the noise, connect the mapping node to it, and change the noise type to rigid multifractal. Reduce the scale of the noise and increase the gain and detail, same as what we did for the background. Then add a mix node, connect the first noise in the A input and the second noise in the B input, and drag the slider to about 0.8. Then connect the result in the base color of our material. Ctrl Shift and left click to view. It's pretty dark, so let's add a math node and change the type to power and reduce the exponent, which will make it brighter. Then create a bump node and connect our combined noise in the height input. Create a displacement node and connect the same input here. Then connect the displacement node to the displacement input of material output node. Then go into the material tab, click on settings and change the displacement type to displacement and bump. And it looks horrible because the displacement is too much. Let's change the mid-level to 0 and the scale to a very low number. Now we have displacement and the bump. Now add a geometry node and a color ramp and connect the pointiness output in the color ramp. Then drag the slider until we only have this texture visible on the edges. Let's move all these nodes to the side and add a mix color node. Connect the first noise in the A input and this edge texture in the B input. Change the blend mode to multiply and drag the slider all the way to 1. This will add some additional breakup to our texture. You can see the difference. Now let's add another mix color node, drag it here, and connect the edge texture that we just created in the B input. Add a math node, change the type to power, and reduce the exponent value. This will make the edges look a bit better. Right now, the stone is looking too bright, so let's reduce the brightness of it. Select the inside sphere and create a new material. Name this material light_matte. Then delete this shader and add an emission shader and change the color to blue. Now add a cube, scale it on the y-axis to make a rectangle, and name it volume. Then give it a material. Delete this node and add a principal volume. Connect it to the volume input. Then select this node, then press Ctrl-Shift-T and delete the image texture. Connect the object coordinates to the mapping node and add a noise texture. Connect the mapping node to the noise texture. Now in the noise texture node, decrease the scale of the noise and connect the result to density input. It is way too dense right now, so let's add a color ramp node and drag the slider to increase the contrast. Then add a math node, change it to power, and increase the exponent value to reduce the volume. Now it's looking better. But the problem with this method is that this does not look realistic. We can of course make it look better by duplicating this noise, changing the scale, and then mixing it with the original noise. Move all this to the side, and then connect our combined noise to the color ramp. Now we have more detailed volume as compared to the previous one, and disconnect the surface. Now press Ctrl Alt and 0 to move the camera to this view. And in the output tab, change the resolution to 1000 by 1000 pixels. Select the camera, go into the properties, and change the focal length to 55 mm. Then in the viewport, press N, select the view tab and turn on camera to view. Then turn off camera to view so we don't accidentally move our camera. The volume is still looking a bit dense, so let's reduce its value. Now select this light, duplicate it and move it on the other side. And change the intensity to 500. Or maybe 200. Then duplicate this light again. And also move it to the front. And change the intensity to 50. Let's select the key light and increase the intensity to 1200. Now for the final render, go into the render tab and change the max samples for render to 256. And also make sure denoise is enabled. Then in the performance tab, change the tile size to 512. Now select the camera and turn on depth of field. And click on the side hopper and select our stone. Oops, it selected the volume. So let's remove it and click here and select our stone. Change the f-stop to 1.5. Then go up here and select render. Now let's add some post-processing. Go into the compositing workspace, click on Use Nodes, and Ctrl-Shift and left-click on this node to view it. Move these nodes to the side. Shift right-click and drag to create a router node, and connect it to the viewer. Then add an ellipse node, and adjust the width and the height according to the frame. Then add an invert color node and a blur node with a very big blur like 500. Create a hue saturation value node, drag it here, and connect the blur node to it. Let's connect it here so we can view it, and drag the value slider down to create vignette. Let's also add brightness contrast node and set the contrast to 6. Maybe that's too much. Let's set it to 5. It looks good. Now to save this image, click on the viewer node, go into the node tab and select save this image. Also, when you hit render next time, the render will have this post processing automatically applied.